viewers. Welcome to another episode of Faces of Founders. Today we have Professor Frances Latchford joining us. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for inviting me today.
Awesome. You're welcome. First of all, please tell us about your program and your position within it.
Well, I'm the chair of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies in Founders College in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. And the school is a pan faculty unit, and we have a number of programs. Our school is interesting because we're both at Glendon and at Liberal Arts and Professional Studies.
Okay.
In terms of our undergraduate programs, Sexuality Studies and Gender and Women's Studies. So we have programs in French and in English. And
Wow.
you can take courses in French that can count towards your degrees that you take in English at Kiel campus, or vice versa. You can take courses in English towards your degree in at Glendon in gender and women's studies or sexuality studies. So that's interesting about our school. The other thing that's interesting about our school is we have our own library, feminist library, which is the Nellie Langford library. It's something that's nice for our students and makes our school, a bit more intimate. You don't have to rely only on the big, massive libraries at York. So that's a nice feature of our school. Also, we have a graduate program. Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies is our graduate program. And something else that's interesting about our school is we have a bridging program for women. And this allows people who say have been maybe didn't finish high school or have been out of high school for many, many years, didn't go to university. They can take a bridging course. And if they do well, they can use it to get into a BA program in any of our programs. And so that facilitates and or supports people who maybe didn't have the opportunity to go to university when they were young and can, enter into the university environment when they're older. We also have a new bridging program as well in sex studies that's going to be taking place via the 519 Community Center on Church Street, which is, in the heart of the LGBTQ2 spirit, community, or at least the 501 community center caters to those people, or all of the queers, let's say. And I certainly have spent a lot of time at 501 in my lifetime. And so it's neat to be partnering with them and to be offering a bridging program for LGBTQ2 spirit people who also, maybe didn't get the chance to go to university when they were younger. So the school is a pretty interesting place because of all the unique programs it offers and the way it's small, and so it's also quite intimate. So there's a real sense of community and spirit in our school. And our students tend to be pretty active and political and involved in culture and society on many fronts. So it's a wonderful place to work, and it's a wonderful place to be meeting students, and the faculty are also lovely.
Stupendous. I didn't know that the library is part of your department there, so that's interesting to know.
Any students can come and visit the library and take out books, but the focus of the library in terms of the books and the acquisitions that it makes are catered to the subject areas that
Okay.
are related to gender, feminist, and sexuality studies and women's studies, and also, from an intersectional perspective and interdisciplinary perspective. So they would certainly be looking at questions of race and class and ability and gender and sexuality as those things interact, for instance, say with feminism or women's issues or gender, or, insofar as all these things
Yeah.
intersect in different ways and impact on each other in different ways. So that is what the purpose of the library is. It's a small but specialized library with books and materials for students who are interested in intersectional politics and intersectional studies.
Fantastic. All right, thanks for telling us.
No worries.
In what ways do you see your program contributing to the fabric of the founders community through the lens of the college's motto, self culture, and society?
Well, I guess one of the ways is the way in which our students and our faculty tend to be quite involved socially and politically at York,
Yeah.
and the college included. But there's a real sense of community in our school, and I think that a lot of our students are involved in events and activities at the college level, at the school level, but also a lot of them tend to get involved in terms of student politics at York. So and also just politics in the world in terms of culture. And insofar as our programs are, ones that focus on critical analysis and critical thinking, critical studies, our students contribute to culture and ideas around self by looking at questions of, say, identity and or non-identity, looking at ideas or norms in culture and challenging them in a certain way, pushing for progress around opening people's minds around norms and normativity. So I think the students in our school and the programming in our school is in constant dialogue with culture because it's always aiming a critical lens at culture and cultural norms and social norms, and asking whether or not those norms are serving people well, whether they're marginalizing people. Um, do we need, which norms should we, protect? Which ones should we maybe think about replacing? Those sorts of things, or opening up or challenging. So, in terms of culture and society and self, I think what goes on in the school is a constant critical lens being aimed on meanings of the self, meanings of identity, meanings of culture, and meanings related to society as it relates to norms and expectations of what it is to be a good or a bad human being in the world.
Do you have a I'm sure you probably do, but I'm not sure personally of if there is, but do you have like a undergraduate association or like a master's graduate association for your students?
Uh,
Like a club
yes,
where
we
they
have
come.
student associations
Yeah.
for both our undergrad and our graduate
Okay.
students. So, but we have offer both an MA and a PhD program,
Okay.
and we have a graduate students association at both the graduate level and the undergraduate level and there's a sex studies students association and a gender and women's studies association,
Okay.
gender and women's studies student association.
Oh, nice, nice. That's great. If you could become a student again and wanted to become more involved, what would be your top two choices and activities to get more involved with the college?
Well, I think something that, for me, when I was a student at York, I did my PhD at York.
Oh, you went to York? Nice.
Yes, I did. And one of the things I always loved about York is that, people always refer to York as a commuter campus, and
Hmm.
that wasn't my experience of York as a student.
Okay.
There were there was a real sense of community on the parts of students, and we socialized a lot on campus. There'd be events, and you'd go out. There would be social events. You'd meet at a pub or meet at a restaurant or what have you. I There was a lot of student um, activity on campus, community on campus. And there was also a lot of community between students and professors. And oftentimes, a class might spill out into the halls and you go and have a coffee, a group of students and their professor. And so there was a real social interaction that happened between students and faculty when I was a student, and it happened quite often. And I think one of the things that York students always benefit from is socializing with each other, making social connections with each other, and with making a point of knowing their professors, trying to, make sure you know who your professor is. And as York has grown, so have our classes. So of course it's harder to get to know your professors a little bit, right? And students are working and people are busy. But I think it's very important for students, if there's anything that they should try and do is try and be involved to the extent that they can on campus, because when you're involved in events and social activities and on campus, whether it's you're going to say book launches or to see speakers or social events, if a departmental social, those kinds of things, you're making connections and meeting people and networking. And while it might not, mean anything in the moment, I don't mean anything. I mean, how do I say it? Well, it might not occur to you in the moment
Okay.
that this interaction is something that will sustain you throughout, years to come, and sustain you in many ways. You'll make friends that you'll keep for life, for instance, at university, or you meet a professor and you have a conversation, and then they remember you because an opportunity comes up and somebody asks them, do you know a student who's doing any work on this? And just because
Yeah.
you had that conversation at a social, a professor might say, oh, I know a perfect student for that, or what have you. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's really important to be involved in the community at York, the various communities at York, because all kinds of other opportunities emerge from those social interactions and interpersonal encounters on campus, at the community level, between students and professors. These things are all very important for students in terms of their futures, asking professors to write letters. If a professor doesn't know your name, and hasn't met you before, ever had a conversation, they're not going to be in a position to write you a letter to say go to grad school or to get a job
Hmm.
somewhere. So those social events are really important, because that is where you start to meet people in all different parts of the university. So that would be one of the things that I think would be, really important to do, and to increase the number of activities.
Do you have any place specifically that you like to go to at York that's still around? I don't know. Is there like a specific? I'm not sure of how long the specific pubs have been there, but are they
Well, a lot of them are gone. It's true. A
okay?
lot of them are gone. Certainly used to go to Winter's Pub back in the day. As a grad student, there used to be a grad pub in Ross up on I think it was the seventh floor. And now there's a faculty and graduate club, but I haven't been there for a couple of years because of the pandemic. So I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
know what's going on there, what kind of programming they do or don't have there at this point. And I'm sure there'll be a return to that once the pandemic ends. But I don't know these days what students are up to and where they're socializing on campus. I mean, I know about events in the college, things that are planned in the college, but in terms of the other across campus, I don't necessarily know anymore.
The seventh floor on Ross, a pub that's hard for me to imagine, but I totally believe that it was there. But
Yeah, no, it
is
was
it
there. It was
always
very big too.
wow?
Yeah, it was for graduate students, and it
Okay.
was it was a pub restaurant, but it was quite a big
Oh, pub
space.
restaurant.
Yeah, it was a pub restaurant,
Restaurant. That's
and
harder for me to
it
imagine.
was pretty
Okay.
busy. It was always pretty busy, in the evenings especially, because back in those days too, getting to and from campus, people would stick around, hang out, and then all go home together on the TTC. They'd hop
Oh,
on that bus that was, it was a half an hour bus ride to Wilson subway station, and then they'd head downtown. So it was quite, it was you were together for quite some time, and you made really close personal friendships back then. I think probably too, fewer students had cars back in those days as well.
oh, okay. I see. Yeah, seems like a lot of fun.
It
I
was
thought
a
it
lot of
was.
fun. It was a lot of fun.
That's great. Thank you. The unifying question. So we ask everyone, what inspires you to study the subject field that you have chosen, and if you ever studied something prior, you can mention that too. Whatever you like.
Sure. Well, what inspires me? So my work is on uh, critical adoption studies is my main area of focus, coupled with
Hmm.
sexuality studies. So those are the two areas that I tend to do research in and write about. And my interest in critical adoption studies stems from my personal experience. My own family is made up of adoptive and biological ties, and is quite large. And I grew up in an environment where, anybody who encountered your family, if your family's different because of adoption, and if your relationships are different are perceived as different because of adoption, you are constantly interrogated about your ties and your family and the reality of your family ties. And this, as a as a kid, was something that I really found troubling and upsetting for many reasons. And so it has informed my research interests as it relates to critical adoption studies. And in particular, I like to use the concept of adoption or the lens of adoption as a way of looking at culture and society and the ways in which people with non biological ties who form families are construed or pathologized or differentiated and set up as a non-normative, the ways in which their relationships and connections to each other are suspect, the ways in which people treat you as though your family ties are not real or somehow inferior to biological ties. And so these questions, which are rooted in my family history, are ones that have driven my research interests in many respects, and also the ways in which our ideas about family and identity are tied to knowing what I would call your biogenealogy or your biogenealogical knowledge. And one of the things I'm really interested in is how there's this expectation that we must have this information, our biogenealogical information, in order to have a complete sense of self. And I'm really interested in the question of how and why did we ever arrive at this idea that in order to know who and what you are, you must know your biogenealogical
Mm.
information, or as though, so for instance, if you don't grow up in your biological family, how is it we've arrived at this idea that somebody who is adopted, say, or doesn't grow up with biological ties, is somehow lacking in terms of a sense of self or a sense of completeness or wholeness? How did this idea emerge? And how did we arrive at the idea to be a whole person? You have to have this information. And what are the implications of that idea that a complete sense of self turns on having access to this information? Who does it serve? What institutions in culture and society are served by this idea, this deep seated belief? And what is it we're trying to protect with respect to this idea? And why don't we ever criticize it? Why don't we ever critique it? Why don't we ever challenge it? And why is it that there's often a huge backlash if you do try to critique it or challenge it? And what does it mean, for instance, nowadays when there's so much interest in DNA ancestry and
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
following your family tree and putting your family
Yep.
tree together? What does it mean that there's such a huge popular interest in that? And how does it serve us? And what narratives do we write about ourselves as individuals? How do we frame ourselves in particular ways in light of these historical facts, which are things that we may not have ever experienced, or are about people that we never knew interpersonally, that we had no interaction with, but somehow we assume that, you know, just because we're biologically tied or tied in terms of DNA to somebody, say, 200 years ago, who we never met, never experienced in our interpersonal or social relationships, how is it we've arrived at this idea that somehow the fact that we have this DNA or biological relationship somehow informs who and what we are? And so I'm really interested in those questions, how we arrive at concepts of self uh, as it relates to what we think biological ties or DNA means with respect to who and what we are.
Yeah, you can't really do much if people if they've passed away, or other than maybe visit where they are buried. But yeah, it's interesting, and your research is definitely interesting too as well. Yeah, I've heard many adopted people, they want to, like you said, find out where their true family is, and to give them a sense of completion. So I know what you're saying there, and it's interesting to challenge it as well. Like I never thought of that, so that's great.
Well, you can also challenge it in other ways. This idea that by virtue of the fact that you're living with your biological family, one of the things that we rarely question is even if, you're suffering, you could be suffering violence or, abuse in your biological family, but there's still this idea that even if you've had, a harsh experience in your biological family, that somehow at all costs you must maintain those biological ties to the best of your ability. They're still family. Family comes first. So, and when one says family comes first, what we usually mean is biological family comes first.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be at personal expense. It can mean you put people that don't love you, that don't treat you well, ahead of people that do, by virtue of the fact that you have biological ties to the ones that don't treat you well. Actually, Bell Hooks writes, who is an important anti-racist feminist author. She's written a number of books about love, and one of the things she talks about is, you know, what does love mean in the context of a family? And she talks about, that saying, love is as love does. And really what she's getting at is that question of, what does love mean in a family? Is it just by virtue of the fact that you are, say, biological family, that there's going to be love? And she raises a question about, love as a practice. Love is something that you do. It's not something that you're born with, and it's not something that you're necessarily going to receive by virtue of having a biological tie to somebody. So it's an interesting book, which you could probably find her book. I can't remember the title, but it's her first book about love. She's written a number of them. You'd probably find the book in the library, the Nellie Library,
Oh,
in the school, if you're interested.
yeah. If anyone's interested, go take a look. It is for what you've said. Yeah, it sounds like super fascinating, and I didn't know there was such fascinating research about that topic. So thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome.
All right, so that concludes all the questions for the interview. I really appreciate learning some new things today, and for bringing your perspectives and about the cool things that York I didn't know about, especially like you said, the restaurant and how some of the social culture was back then. So thank you for your time and for coming on the show today.
Okay, well, thank you, Catherine, for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. All right, bye everyone. See you later.
Bye bye.